It was August 2018. In the quiet, suburban town of Frederick, Colorado, the Watts family looked like the picture of American success. Their 5-bedroom home on Saratoga Trail was a symbol of a life well lived. Inside, it was a home filled with the laughter of 2 little girls, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste. Their mother, 34-year-old Shanann Watts, was a prolific user of social media, and her Facebook page was a vibrant, curated gallery of domestic bliss. There were photos of family vacations, videos of the girls singing, and loving tributes to her husband, 33-year-old Chris Watts. "He's the best thing that's ever happened to me," she'd said in one video. Shanann was an open book, sharing her life, her struggles with lupus, and her excitement for her work with the wellness brand Louvel. To her thousands of followers, she was building a community around the idea of the perfect family. And that summer, their family was about to grow. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with a boy they had already named Nico. The narrative was flawless. A handsome, doting husband, 2 beautiful daughters, and a son on the way. But behind the sun-drenched photos and cheerful posts, a darkness was gathering, a rot eating away at the foundations of their carefully constructed world. It was a darkness no one, not even their closest friends, could see until it was far too late. The story Shanann was telling the world was the story she desperately wanted to be true. The reality was a nightmare waiting to unfold in the pre-dawn hours of Monday, August 13th, 2018. The silence on Saratoga Trail was broken by a car pulling up to the Watts home. Around 1:48 a.m., Shanann returned from a business trip, dropped off by her friend and colleague, Nicole Atkinson. Tired but happy to be home, she walked to her front door, back to her husband and sleeping children. It was the last time anyone, other than her killer, would see her alive. Later that morning, the first flicker of concern began. Nicole Atkinson, the friend who had just dropped Shanann off, started to worry. Shanann, who was always responsive, wasn't answering her texts. Then, she missed a 10 a.m. doctor's appointment. An appointment she was excited about, a chance to hear her unborn son's heartbeat. For Nicole, this wasn't just unusual. It was a blaring alarm bell. She knew her friend. Shanann lived on her phone. It was her connection to her work, her friends, her entire world. And she would never miss a doctor's appointment for her baby. Nicole drove to the house. When she found the door locked from the inside with security latch, her concern morphed into real fear. She called Chris at his job at Anadarko Petroleum. He sounded unconcerned, telling Nicole that Shanann had taken the girls on a play date. But Nicole's eyes told her a different story. "Chris, her car's in the garage," she said, a fact that made his explanation fall apart instantly. The kids' car seats were in that vehicle. Shanann couldn't have gone anywhere. At 1:40 p.m., Nicole Atkinson made the call that would officially begin the search. She called the Frederick Police Department and requested a welfare check. What happened next is now a chilling piece of true crime history, captured by a police officer's body camera. The footage shows a responding officer meeting a seemingly cooperative Chris Watts at his home. Chris lets the officer inside and the search begins. At first glance, the house is neat, almost sterile. There are no obvious signs of a struggle, no immediate red flags. But for those who knew Shanann, the scene was deeply unsettling. On the kitchen counter lay her purse, with her wallet and keys inside. Her essential lupus medication was also left behind. Lodged between the couch cushions, investigators found her cell phone, her lifeline, and on the nightstand in the master bedroom sat her wedding ring. Each item was another piece in a terrifying puzzle. Shanann Watts and her daughters had not left this house voluntarily. A woman doesn't leave without her phone, her purse, her money, or her medication. And a pregnant woman, deeply in love with her husband, does not leave her wedding ring behind. As the officer methodically documents the scene, Chris hovers nearby, his demeanor a strange contradiction. He appears calm, even helpful, but there's a total lack of the frantic panic you'd expect from a man whose entire family has vanished. He's performing concern. The most disturbing discovery, however, was in the bedrooms. The beds were unmade, which was uncharacteristic for the tidy Shanann. But it was more than that. A fitted sheet was missing from the master bed. The matching top sheet was later found balled up in a trash can. It was a small, bizarre detail, but one that felt profoundly wrong. Something terrible had happened in this house. The home that Shanann had so proudly displayed to the world was now a crime scene. With his family officially missing, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI joined the case by Tuesday, August 14th. The disappearance of a pregnant mother and 2 small children was now a major news story, and Chris Watts was thrust into the national spotlight. He agreed to give televised interviews, a decision that would become a masterclass in deception and a key piece of evidence against him. Sitting on his front porch, Chris faced the cameras and delivered his now infamous plea. "I'm just hoping that she's somewhere safe right now and with the kids," he said, his voice steady. "If somebody has her, just please bring her back." To a casual viewer, he might have seemed like a grieving husband, shell-shocked and numb. But to seasoned investigators and body language experts, his performance was riddled with red flags. Experts who later dissected this footage pointed to the distinct lack of genuine sadness. There was a self-conscious rocking, a defensive folding of the arms, and a strange, fleeting smile that seemed entirely out of place. He spoke of his daughters in the past tense. Most telling was his intense stare into the camera. It wasn't the look of a man lost in grief, but of someone desperately trying to see if his audience was buying the story he was selling. He was playing the part of the distraught husband, but the emotional core was missing. It was a hollow, chilling portrayal. While Chris played a role for the cameras, investigators were working tirelessly behind the scenes, digging into the life he had tried so hard to keep hidden. They pulled phone records and financial statements, and began interviewing friends and colleagues. It didn't take long for the facade of the perfect marriage to crumble. The truth was, Chris Watts was living a double life. For weeks, he'd been having a passionate affair with a coworker, a woman named Nicole Kessinger. The relationship had begun while Shanann and the girls were on an extended trip visiting family. According to Kessinger, Chris had told her he was in the final stages of a divorce. He was a devoted father, he claimed, but his marriage was over. She believed him. She had even helped him look for an apartment for himself and his daughters. The discovery of the affair was the explosive revelation that changed everything. Chris Watts was no longer just a potential witness. He was now the prime suspect. He had a motive. He wanted a new life with his new girlfriend, unencumbered by a wife, 2 daughters, and a baby on the way. His public pleas were now cast in a sinister new light. They weren't pleas for their safety. They were part of a cold-blooded performance designed to mislead police and buy himself time. Nicole Kessinger, realizing she had been systematically lied to, began cooperating fully with investigators. She shared their text messages and told them that on the night of the disappearance, Chris had seemed calm. He texted her that his family was gone, as if they had simply evaporated. As the search for Shanann intensified and her face was all over the news, Kessinger noticed Chris's strange lack of emotion. He seemed more inconvenienced than devastated. The public knew Chris as the grieving family man, but investigators now knew a different Chris Watts. They knew the liar, they knew the adulterer, and they were beginning to suspect they knew the killer. By Wednesday, August 15th, 2 days after his family vanished, the investigation was closing in. With the affair confirmed and his story full of holes, investigators decided it was time for a polygraph test. A polygraph isn't admissible in court, but is an incredibly effective interrogation tool. The prospect of being scientifically proven a liar can be enough to shatter a guilty person's composure. Chris agreed to take the test, likely believing he was smart enough to outwit everyone. He walked into the examination room still clinging to his story. He and Shanann had an emotional conversation about separating, and then he left for work, believing she and the girls were safe. The polygraph examiner began the session. The questions were calm, methodical, and direct. Did you physically cause Shanann's disappearance? Do you know where your daughters are? Are you lie about the last time you saw them? With each critical question, Chris answered no. And with each no, the needles on the machine jumped, charting the physiological storm raging within him. His body was betraying the lies his mouth was telling. He was failing spectacularly. When the test was over, the examiner and an FBI agent confronted him. The moment of truth had arrived. "You did not pass your polygraph test, Chris," they told him bluntly. There are some things in here that were completely deceptive. The impact was immediate. The confident facade he had maintained for 2 days finally cracked. He slumped in his chair, his head in his hands. He started to ramble, to bargain, to look for any way out. He admitted to the affair, a fact he knew they'd already uncovered, presenting it as a shameful secret rather than a motive for murder. This was the moment investigators were waiting for. They had him cornered. Seeing his desperation, they pressed their advantage with a brilliant interrogation tactic. They asked Chris if he would be willing to speak with his father, Ronnie Watts, who had traveled to Colorado to support him. Chris agreed, likely seeing his father as an ally who would believe his side of the story. Investigators led Ronnie into the room. It was no longer a suspect in the law. It was a father and son. An agent gently prompted Chris, "You need to tell your dad what you're keeping inside." It was a key that unlocked the first confession. But the story that spilled out of Chris Watts wasn't the truth. It was a new, more sinister lie, a last-ditch effort to paint himself not as a monster, but as a victim. Alone in the room with his father, Chris Watts finally broke his silence. But what came out was a twisted, self-serving story designed to minimize his own guilt. Speaking in a low voice, he confessed to killing his wife, Shanann. But he immediately followed it with a monstrous accusation. He claimed that after he told Shanann he wanted a divorce, he saw her on the baby monitor strangling their daughter Celeste, while Bella was already blue and lifeless in her bed. In his telling, he flew into an uncontrollable rage and killed Shanann in retaliation. He was trying to sell a new story. He wasn't a family annihilator. He was a father who had snapped after witnessing an unspeakable act. This confession is a chilling window into a psychopathic mind. Faced with undeniable proof of his deception, Chris didn't confess to his real crime. Instead, he crafted a new lie that shifted the ultimate blame onto his primary victim. He murdered Shanann twice, first with his hands, and then again with his words, trying to destroy her reputation and paint her as a monster. It was a calculated act of self-preservation, a desperate attempt to appear more tragic than evil. Investigators, listening from an adjacent room, were immediately skeptical. The story didn't make any sense. Shanann was, by all accounts, a deeply devoted mother. The idea that she would suddenly murder her own children was completely at odds with everything they knew about her, and his story just didn't hold up. He was casting himself as a man pushed beyond his limits. But his actions, the affair, the lies, the calm demeanor on television, all pointed premeditation, not a spontaneous crime of passion. This wasn't how a man who had just witnessed the slaughter of his children would behave. It was how a man trying to cover his tracks would behave. Despite their disbelief, the investigators played along. They had a partial confession, and most importantly, they now had leverage. If Chris killed Shanann, he knew where her body was. And if he knew where her body was, he knew where his daughters were, too. The focus of the interrogation shifted. It was no longer about getting him to admit guilt, but about finding the victims. "Were they, Chris?" they asked over and over. "Where did you put them?" Pressured by his father and the investigators, and clinging to his fabricated story, Chris finally agreed to tell them. He revealed that he had taken their bodies to a remote oil work site owned by his employer. With this crucial information, the search for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste was about to come to its grim conclusion. The caravan of law enforcement vehicles set off into the night, with a killer leading the way. Under the vast, dark sky of rural Colorado, Chris Watts led investigators to Service 319, a remote oil and gas site. It was a desolate, industrial landscape, a place of work now set to become a place of profound tragedy. His fabricated story had led police to this spot, but the physical evidence here would soon tell the real story, a version far more horrific than the lie he had concocted. As the sun rose on August 16th, investigators began the grim task of recovery. Following Chris's directions, they first located a shallow grave. Buried there was the body of Shanann Watts. She was 34 years old and 15 weeks pregnant with their son, Nico. The man who had vowed to protect her had wrapped her in a bedsheet and discarded her body like trash. But the most gut-wrenching discovery was yet to come. Chris pointed towards 2 large, separate oil tanks. He admitted that he had put his daughters inside. Crews had to drain the thick, toxic crude oil from the tanks to reach the small bodies submerged within. First, they found 3-year-old Celeste. Then, in the other tank, they found 4-year-old Bella. The discovery of the girls' bodies in the oil tanks demolished Chris's story, a grieving father. Even one who had just committed a violent act in a fit of rage would not have had the cold, methodical presence of mind to dispose of his children's bodies in such a horrific and desecrating manner. This wasn't rage. This was the work of a monster trying to erase his family so he could begin a new life. The full, unadulterated truth would later be revealed in a detailed confession Chris gave from prison months after his conviction. He admitted his story about Shanann was a lie from the start. The real sequence of events was a chilling portrait of calculated cruelty. He had strangled Shanann in their bed. As he was wrapping her body in a sheet, his daughter Bella walked in and asked what was wrong with Mommy. He told her she was sick. He then put both of his daughters, still alive, into the back seat of his truck, with their mother's body at their feet, and drove 45 minutes to the oil site. At the site, he smothered Celeste with her favorite blanket, while her older sister Bella watched. After putting Celeste's body into an oil tank, he returned to the truck. According to Chris's own confession, Bella's last words were a desperate plea. "Daddy, no." He then smothered her with the same blanket and put her body in the second tank. The autopsies would later confirm their causes of death. Shanann had been strangled. Bella and Celeste had been smothered. The search for answers was over. Chris was not snapped. He had planned. He wanted his family gone, and he carried out their executions with a chilling precision that defies all human decency. The psychology behind a crime this monstrous is as fascinating as it is disturbing. If you want to understand the minds of killers and the investigations that bring them to justice, subscribe for more in-depth analyses like this one that faced with irrefutable evidence. Chris Watts' legal battle was short. To avoid the death penalty, a decision supported by Shanann's family who wished for no more death, he pleaded guilty on November 6, 2018. He was charged with 9 counts, including first-degree murder, the unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and tampering with deceased bodies. On November 19, 2018, he was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 84 years. The judge called it perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime I have handled out of thousands of cases that I have seen. In the aftermath, the profound grief of Shanann's family was laid bare. In powerful victim impact statements, they spoke of their beautiful daughter and angelic granddaughters. Shanann's father, Frederick, faced his son-in-law in court and called him an evil monster. "I trusted you to take care of them, not kill them," he said, his voice thick with pain. "You may have taken their bodies from me, but you will never take the love they had from me." As if their loss wasn't enough, the family also had to endure relentless online harassment and cruel conspiracy theories, a secondary trauma that compounded their unimaginable pain. The case of the Watts family murders remains a dark fixture in the public consciousness. It's a terrifying cautionary tale about the chasm that can exist between a curated online image and a dark, private reality. It forced a conversation about the hidden nature of domestic abuse and the terrifying reality of family annihilators, who so often appear as normal, even gentle people. True evil doesn't always announce itself with a roar. Sometimes it whispers loving words, it smiles in family photos, and it pleads for its victims to come home, all while knowing it's responsible for their silence. The most chilling answer uncovered in the desperate search for Shanann and her daughters was the simplest one. The monster wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was the one they called husband and daddy.